Welcome to a world of winter's secrets and magic. Tonight, we journey to the kingdom of Thaliora, where an eternal frost reigns, and a black cat leads a prince to the heart of an ice queen's sorrow. Let go of your day, close your eyes, and let the quiet whispers of the castle guide you to a peaceful sleep. There was a time when the kingdom of Thaliora flourished beneath the sun's gentle gaze. Its hills were a patchwork of green and gold, where orchards brimmed with fruit and streams whispered songs to the wind. Villagers strolled through cobblestone squares, laughter mingling with the toll of bells. Every spring, a festival of blossoms marked the arrival of the season, a tradition so old that even the elders could not recall its origin. But such memories had long been buried beneath an unyielding frost. One winter night, years ago, the skies darkened unnaturally. The stars seemed to vanish, replaced by clouds that churned like restless seas. From the horizon, a chill crept forth, devouring the warmth of the earth. The first snowflake fell at the stroke of midnight, though it was not soft or playful. It was sharp, crystalline, and cold enough to burn. By dawn, Thaliora was unrecognizable, a land locked in ice, its once vivid colors bleached white and grey. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Ice Queen, a figure who had emerged from the far north, her arrival heralded by blizzards. Her beauty was said to be otherworldly, skin as pale as snow, hair like moonlight, and eyes colder than the heart of winter. But beneath her regal exterior, she carried a wrath so fierce it could freeze the sun itself. No one dared approach her castle, which appeared atop Frostspine Mountain the night the curse began. It was a structure of impossible design, as though carved from a single block of shimmering ice. Its spires pierced the sky, and its gates reflected the moonlight like polished mirrors. The Ice Queen's power spread swiftly. Rivers froze solid, trees were encased in glassy prisons of frost. Even the air seemed heavy, as if time itself had slowed. Crops withered, animals perished, and despair took root in the hearts of Thaliora's people. The curse was absolute, and no force, mortal or divine, seemed able to break it. As the years passed, hope became a rare and fragile thing. Travelers who dared to ascend Frostspine Mountain in search of the Queen never returned, their footprints swallowed by the snow. Some whispered that they had been turned to ice statues, while others claimed they were trapped in an endless labyrinth of frozen corridors. Whatever their fate, the result was the same: silence. Yet, even in the darkest winters, faint embers of defiance remained. The villagers lit candles in their windows, small beacons of resistance against the Queen's unrelenting night. They whispered prayers to forgotten gods and told tales of heroes who would one day save them. Still, with each passing year, the candles burned lower and the stories grew fewer. Then, one fateful evening, something changed. It began with a whisper carried on the icy wind. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it stirred unease among the villagers. The whisper grew into a howl, then a roar, as if the mountain itself were exhaling. Snow swirled violently in the square, forming a column of blinding white. When it settled, a single figure stood in its place. It was not the Ice Queen, nor was it one of her frozen victims. It was a cat, sleek and black as midnight, its eyes glimmering like emeralds. It padded silently through the snow, leaving a trail of wet paw prints behind it. Though small, it exuded an undeniable presence, as if it carried centuries of secrets within its unblinking gaze. The villagers dared not approach, for they sensed the cat was no ordinary creature. They retreated to their homes, bolting their doors and drawing their curtains. Yet, through the cracks, they watched as the mysterious feline roamed the square, its movements deliberate, its head tilting as if listening to a voice only it could hear. When the cat paused at the frozen fountain in the square's center, something remarkable happened. The ice on the fountain cracked. A sound sharper than the snap of a branch, and a faint trickle of water began to flow. The cat, seemingly satisfied, turned its gaze toward the edge of the village, where a weary traveler staggered into view. The man was young, his armor dented and frosted with ice. A sword hung limply at his side, its blade dulled by countless battles. His face, though obscured by frost, carried the marks of exhaustion and grief. He was no ordinary wanderer. The villagers knew instinctively that he was a prince, though they could not guess from where. The black cat moved toward him, its emerald eyes alight with an unspoken purpose. It circled him once, then began walking away, pausing only to glance back, as if inviting him to follow. The prince hesitated, his breath visible in the freezing air, before taking a faltering step forward. Thus began a journey that would change the fate of Thaliora, though neither the prince nor the villagers could yet fathom the trials to come. In the shadow of Frostspine Mountain, the black cat led the way, its paw prints steaming in the snow, toward the heart of the Ice Queen's domain. The climb to Frostspine Mountain was a trial in itself, an ordeal that seemed designed to strip a man of his will. Icy winds howled like the mournful cries of forgotten spirits, and the ground beneath the prince's boots was treacherously slick. The world around him was a tapestry of endless white, so blindingly cold that it stole not only warmth but thought, reducing everything to survival. Yet, the black cat moved with effortless grace, gliding over the snow as though it were a summer meadow. Its emerald eyes pierced the storm, offering an unspoken promise of guidance. The prince followed, his breath shallow and his limbs aching. He had no choice but to trust this enigmatic creature, for it was the only thing in this frozen wasteland that moved with purpose. The path wound higher and higher, the air thinning with every step. The cat seemed tireless, pausing only when the prince faltered. Each time it would sit, curling its tail around its paws, and fix him with a gaze that seemed to penetrate his very soul. The prince could feel the weight of those eyes, as though the cat were measuring him, judging his resolve. The ascent blurred into an endless cycle of cold and exertion. But then, at last, the storm began to abate. The prince lifted his head and saw it, the Ice Queen's castle. It rose from the peak like a spectral apparition, its spires catching the pale light of the hidden moon. The structure seemed to defy logic, as though it had been conjured rather than built. Its walls shimmered like frozen waterfalls, and its gates, taller than any cathedral, glinted with an unnatural brilliance. The cat paused at the edge of the great gates, its tail twitching. It turned to the prince, its gaze more intense than ever, as if offering a silent warning. This is the point of no return. The prince nodded, though his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The gates opened with a groan that echoed like a dirge, revealing a corridor of gleaming ice. The air inside was colder still, sharp and biting, but it carried a strange sweetness, like the distant memory of spring. The cat stepped inside first, its paw steps muffled by the crystalline floor. The prince followed, his breath fogging the air, his heart pounding. The interior of the castle was a labyrinth of frost and shadow. The walls glimmered like glass, reflecting fractured images of the prince and the cat. At times, the reflections seemed to move independently, their motions unnervingly delayed, as though the castle itself were watching. Icicles hung like daggers from the ceiling, and the floor sparkled with frost that cracked faintly under the prince's boots. As they ventured deeper, the prince began to notice shapes within the ice, figures frozen in mid-motion. A knight, his sword raised in defiance. A maiden, her face etched with terror. Even a child, clutching a wooden toy. Their expressions were vivid, captured as if by some cruel artist. The prince shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that these were not statues. They were people, victims of the Ice Queen's wrath, imprisoned for eternity. The black cat paused before each frozen figure, its tail flicking as if in silent mourning. Then it would move on, leading the prince further into the castle's depths. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of the prince's breathing and the soft tap of the cat's paws. Finally, they reached a vast chamber, its walls curving inward like the hollow of a glacier. At the center stood a throne of jagged ice, and upon it sat the Ice Queen herself. Her figure was still as death, her gown flowing around her like frozen water. Her head was crowned with a circlet of frost, and her hands rested lightly on the arms of the throne. Her eyes, open and unblinking, stared straight ahead, their gaze cold enough to freeze the marrow in one's bones. At her feet lay a single rose encased in ice. Its crimson petals, vivid even in their frozen state, seemed to pulse faintly, as though defying the winter that sought to extinguish it. The black cat approached the throne, its movements slow and deliberate. It leapt gracefully onto the dais, its paw resting on the frozen rose. The prince hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the cat's voice, low, resonant, and otherworldly, echoed in his mind. She waits for one brave enough to enter her sorrow and unlock the truth. Will you take the first step? The prince swallowed hard, his breath catching in his throat. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the ice echoing like the toll of a distant bell. As he drew closer to the throne, he felt a presence pressing down on him, heavy and ancient, like the weight of countless winters. The Ice Queen did not move, yet the air around her seemed alive with unspoken tension. The prince stood before her, his reflection fractured and distorted in the ice around him. He reached out, his gloved hand trembling, and touched the frozen rose. The cold bit into his fingers, but he held firm. A sound like cracking glass reverberated through the chamber. The black cat watched silently, its emerald eyes unblinking, as the first shard of ice splintered away. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the chamber, each shard falling like the tolling of an ancient bell. The frozen rose pulsed faintly under the prince's hand, its crimson hue growing more vivid with each beat. Yet, as the ice began to splinter, the air around him thickened, and the temperature plummeted further still, as though the castle itself resisted his intrusion. The black cat sat unmoving on the dais, its emerald eyes fixed intently on the prince. For all its silence, its presence filled the chamber with an unspoken command. Do not falter. The prince's gloved hand trembled as he tightened his grip on the rose. The ice resisted, its cold biting through leather and flesh alike. He gritted his teeth, his breath fogging the air, and pulled with all his might. With a sudden deafening crack, the frozen shell around the rose shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments, scattering like stars across the icy floor. As the final piece fell, the chamber groaned, a low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the castle's very foundations. The throne room grew darker, the light from the ice walls dimming to a faint, eerie glow. A chill wind swirled through the room, carrying whispers that seemed to speak a language older than time. The prince turned to the Ice Queen. For the first time she stirred. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were awakening from centuries of slumber. Her crystalline gown shifted like flowing water, catching the dim light in mesmerizing patterns. Her eyes, pale and piercing, focused on the prince. They were not empty as he had expected, but filled with an unfathomable sorrow. You dare disturb my slumber? Her voice was soft but carried an icy edge, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. Do you not know what you risk? The prince straightened, though his knees felt weak. "I come not to disturb, but to undo the curse you have cast upon Thaliora." The Ice Queen's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "Undo the curse," she repeated, her tone laced with mockery. "Foolish boy, you see only the frost that lies on the surface. You know nothing of the chains that bind this winter to my heart." The black cat leapt gracefully to the prince's side, its tail curling around his leg. It looked up at the queen, its expression inscrutable, before speaking in its low, resonant voice. "Show him. Let him see what lies beneath the ice." The queen's gaze flickered to the cat, her expression momentarily faltering. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, she raised her hand. The air around her shimmered, and the walls of the chamber began to change. The prince watched in awe as the icy walls turned translucent, revealing scenes frozen within. They were memories, captured in vivid detail, like paintings on glass. He saw a young woman, radiant and full of life, standing in a lush garden. Her laughter seemed to echo faintly, a sound that felt impossibly distant. The scene shifted. The woman now sat on a throne of stone, her expression solemn. Beside her stood a man, his face obscured, but his figure imposing. He held a crown in his hands, its edges glinting with a cruel light. The images moved faster, blurring together in a whirlwind of betrayal and despair. The woman's throne turned to ice, her warm smile replaced by the cold, unyielding mask of the Ice Queen. Her garden withered, the flowers buried under snow. The man vanished into the storm, leaving her alone, her sorrow crystallized into eternal winter. The visions faded, and the chamber returned to its frozen stillness. The prince looked at the queen, his chest heavy with the weight of what he had seen. "You were betrayed," he said softly. "Your heart was broken, and in your pain, you cursed the world to share your suffering." The Ice Queen's gaze turned distant. "Pain does not justify mercy," she said, her voice hollow. "What was taken from me cannot be restored." "But the world does not need to suffer with you," the prince replied. His words, though simple, carried an earnestness that pierced the cold barrier between them. "Let me help you. Together, we can end this winter." The queen's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Help me," she said, her tone sharp. "You presume to understand my sorrow. My pain is a fortress, and it is not so easily breached." The black cat stepped forward, its emerald eyes gleaming. "The rose has begun to thaw," it said. "The choice is yours, Queen of Frost. Will you let this prince into the heart of your sorrow, or will you let winter reign forever?" The queen's gaze lingered on the cat, then shifted to the prince. For a moment, she seemed to waver, her icy exterior cracking just enough to reveal the woman she had once been. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she rose from her throne. "If you truly wish to help," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you must journey to the heart of this castle. There lies the source of my curse, the place where my heart was broken and my winter began." The prince nodded, his resolve firm despite the icy fear creeping through his veins. The black cat flicked its tail and began to lead the way, its movements as deliberate as ever. The Ice Queen watched them go, her pale hand clutching the arm of her throne, her expression unreadable. As the prince followed the cat deeper into the castle, the air grew heavier, the shadows darker. He could feel the weight of the queen's sorrow pressing down on him, an invisible force that threatened to crush his spirit. But he pressed on, knowing that the heart of winter and the hope of spring awaited him at the journey's end. The journey to the heart of the Ice Queen's castle was unlike anything the prince had ever faced. The walls of frost closed in tighter with every step, and the air itself seemed to thrum with an eerie, pulsing rhythm. Shadows danced along the icy surfaces, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were alive and watching. The black cat led the way, its steps silent, its tail flicking in measured beats, as if marking the time left for the prince to succeed or fail. The corridor narrowed, and the cold grew unbearable. Even the prince's armor, though lined with furs, felt like an anchor of ice against his body. He clenched his sword tighter, its hilt slick with frost. Yet the cat never paused. Its green eyes gleamed in the dim light, unwavering and determined. Finally, they reached a door. It was simple compared to the grandeur of the rest of the castle. A slab of dark ice with faint etchings that glimmered like the veins of an ancient tree. The cat stopped and turned to the prince, its emerald gaze intense. "Beyond this door lies the source of the curse," it said, its voice low and resonant. "It is not a place, but a moment, a memory frozen in time, as unyielding as the winter itself. You must face it, not with your sword, but with your heart." The prince's breath caught, visible in the cold air like wisps of smoke. "A memory?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The cat's gaze softened, though its tone remained firm. "The curse is born of grief. It will not be broken by steel, but by the courage to endure what you cannot fight." Before the prince could respond, the door creaked open, revealing a vast circular chamber. At its center, a pedestal rose from the icy floor, and atop it rested a crystal shard glowing faintly with a pale blue light. The room seemed to pulse with its glow, each beat sending a ripple through the air, as if the shard were a heart, alive and burdened. The prince stepped inside, the cat following at his heels. The moment his boots touched the icy floor, the chamber shuddered, and the shard's glow intensified. The air grew heavy, and the light began to coalesce, forming shapes, ghostly translucent figures that moved as if enacting a play. The prince watched as the Ice Queen's past unfolded before him, more vivid than the fragments he had seen before. He saw her as a young woman, her laughter ringing like a bell in a garden of spring blossoms. He saw the man at her side, his face now clear, a king, regal and powerful, yet his smile carried a shadow of ambition. The scene shifted. The man knelt before the woman, offering her a crown of frost and steel. "Together we can rule," he said, his voice rich but edged with cold intent. "You were born for this, my queen." But the young woman hesitated. "The cost," she murmured, her hand lingering on the crown. "What will it cost?" "Everything," the man replied with a cruel smile. And then the crown touched her head, and the world around her erupted into frost and darkness. The garden withered, the blossoms curling into ash. The man vanished into the storm, leaving her alone, her tears freezing as they fell. The memory dissolved, and the prince found himself standing before the crystal shard once more. Its light pulsed erratically now, as though agitated by his presence. He turned to the cat, his voice hoarse. "Her sorrow, it's endless." The cat nodded solemnly. "It is, and it will remain so until someone dares to embrace it, to hold it, and endure its weight. That is the only way to break her winter." The prince hesitated, doubt clawing at him. Could he truly bear the burden of another's pain, one so vast and deep it had consumed an entire kingdom? His heart raced, but then he remembered the frozen figures in the halls, the lives trapped, waiting for freedom. He thought of the villagers, their candles burning faintly in the frost, clinging to the last scraps of hope. He stepped forward. As his hands touched the crystal shard, a searing cold shot through him, piercing him to his core. It was not just physical. He felt the weight of the Ice Queen's grief flood into him, a torrent of sorrow so vast it threatened to drown him. Images flashed through his mind. The betrayal, the loneliness, the despair of a heart shattered and left to freeze. But he did not let go. Instead, he tightened his grip, his resolve burning brighter than the cold. "You are not alone," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Your pain does not define you. It does not have to define this kingdom." The shard's light grew blinding, and the room trembled violently. The prince's heart pounded, his vision blurring, but he held on. He poured every ounce of compassion, every flicker of warmth within him, into the shard. Slowly, the cold began to ebb, and the light softened. When it faded, the chamber was still. The shard lay in the prince's hands, no longer cold but warm, like a flame cradled in crystal. The black cat approached, its emerald eyes glowing with approval. "You have done what no one else could," it said. "You have reached the heart of her sorrow and turned it into hope." The prince looked at the shard, its light now pulsing gently, steadily. He knew his task was not yet complete. The Ice Queen still awaited him, and the final thaw was yet to come. The prince emerged from the chamber, the warm crystal shard cradled in his hands like a fragile ember in a vast, unyielding winter. The black cat walked at his side, its gaze fixed ahead, its silence heavier now than before. The corridors of the Ice Queen's castle seemed darker, quieter, as though holding their breath, awaiting what was to come. When they reached the throne room, the Queen stood before her frozen throne. She was no longer seated in icy stillness. Instead, she moved like a shadow untethered, her pale hands brushing the frost-covered armrests. Her piercing eyes turned to the prince, and for a moment there was no cold fury in them, only weariness. "You have found it," she said softly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of something the prince couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, or fear. The prince stepped forward, the shard's light casting long, flickering shadows on the icy walls. "I have seen your sorrow, your betrayal," he said, his voice steady despite the chill that lingered in the air. "But the pain that binds you does not have to bind this kingdom." The Ice Queen laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. "Do you think sorrow can simply be undone?" she asked. "What has been broken cannot be mended. My winter is not a curse, it is all that remains of me." The black cat leapt gracefully onto the dais, its emerald eyes narrowing as it addressed her. "Winter is not who you are. It is what you've allowed yourself to become. The heart of your pain lies in the belief that you are beyond redemption." The Queen turned her gaze to the cat, her expression unreadable. "And if I am?" she murmured. The prince stepped closer, his breath clouding the air. "You are not," he said, his words soft but unyielding. "The crystal holds the truth of your sorrow, but it also holds your heart. It is still warm. There is still life within it." He held the shard toward her, its light growing brighter, spilling warmth into the cold chamber. The Ice Queen flinched as though the sight of it pained her, but she did not look away. "Take it," the prince urged. "Accept what was broken, but do not let it define you. Let this kingdom bloom again, not as a place of eternal frost, but as one where winter is only a season." The Queen hesitated, her hands hovering over the shard. The chamber seemed to tremble, the ice walls groaning under some unseen weight. The black cat's tail swished, its voice calm but firm. "Your choice will define not only you but the world you've frozen in your grief. Will you hold on to what has broken you, or will you let it go?" With a deep, shuddering breath, the Ice Queen reached out. Her fingers brushed the shard, and a searing light erupted from it, engulfing the throne room. The prince staggered, shielding his eyes, but he did not let go of the crystal. The warmth surged through him, filling the space with a radiance that seemed to push back the cold itself. The Queen cried out, a sound of anguish and release, and fell to her knees as the light wrapped around her. The frost on her gown melted, revealing fabric of silver and blue. Her crown of ice dissolved, replaced by a simple circlet of frost-kissed flowers. When the light dimmed, she looked up at the prince, her eyes no longer cold but filled with tears. The castle began to change. The icy walls melted, cascading into streams of crystal-clear water that pooled and flowed outward, rushing down the mountain. The oppressive cold lifted, and the air grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Outside, the snow began to thaw, revealing green fields and budding trees. The queen rose to her feet, her movements slow, but no longer weighed down by sorrow. "You have done what I could not," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You reminded me that even in the deepest winter, the promise of spring endures." The prince offered her the crystal shard, now no larger than a raindrop, its warmth faint but constant. "This is yours," he said, "a part of you, but not all of you." She accepted it, her fingers curling around it gently. For the first time she smiled, a small tentative gesture, but one that carried a world of meaning. The black cat stepped forward, its emerald eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The winter is over," it said. "The kingdom will remember this day, but the choice to protect it lies with you both." The prince and the queen exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them without words. Together, they walked from the throne room, the cat trailing behind them. As they stepped outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the land in golden light. Streams of water glittered as they raced down the mountain, carrying the remnants of the castle's frost. Below, the kingdom stirred to life. Villagers emerged from their homes, blinking in wonder at the melting snow and the warmth on their faces. Flowers began to bloom where ice had once rained, and the rivers flowed freely once more. The black cat paused at the edge of the mountain path, its mission complete. It turned to the prince one last time, its emerald gaze unreadable. Then, with a flick of its tail, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only faint paw prints in the thawing snow. The Ice Queen remained on the mountainside, her gaze sweeping over the land she had once frozen in grief. The prince stood beside her, the warmth of spring filling the air. Thus, the kingdom of Thaliora bloomed anew, its story a testament to courage, compassion, and the power of a heart willing to heal.